Why should buying potting compost be a risky, you pays your money and takes your chances sort of affair? Let's see if I can help you to get the best results. Always make a point of starting with fresh compost. Look at your local garden centre and make sure that the packs are all nice and plump, as you can see here. You can usually tell if you look in the yard, you can see them all wrapped up behind the scenes, ready to go. The biggest problem is which compost do you choose? Well, these days it's best to go for peat-free or less peat if possible. There are a wide range available to you. The most popular one for the last couple of years, well, I say couple, it's almost 30 or 40 years, has been coir. Probably the two most in use today are the soilless types and the soil or loam-based compost, better known as the John Innes range. Here you can see a loamless on the left and a soil-based type on the right. Never use a compost directly from the bag, it's always rough and lumpy, but loosen it with your hands and get it nice and friable. Gets more air into it and it makes it warmer. Let's look at the soilless range first, starting off with the seed sowing compost. You can see the seed sowing compost identified on the left has a much finer texture than the coarser grained multi-purpose general grown compost on the right, but the principal difference between the two is that the seed sowing compost has hardly any nutrients in it at all, other than a little superphosphate, which is to encourage the development of the root system of the seedlings before being transplanted later on into multi-purpose compost, has sufficient fertilizer to take a plant through to maturity. Let's take a closer look at the general stroke multi-purpose composts. They were developed during the 1960s as a one-step grows all compost to replace the soil-based types. Originally they were peat-based, but in more recent years they've been substituted by wood fibre, composted bark and other wood byproducts. Just to sum up then, you would start your seeds off in the seed sowing compost, and when they reach the first true leaf stage, you would then prick them out into the potting compost to grow on until they were ready for planting out. Let's talk about the soil or loam-based composts that are more popularly known as John Innes range. Prior to the 20th century, most potting composts were the well-kept secret of head gardeners on the large country estates. With the decline of these large estates in the early part of the 20th century, it was realized that a reliable growing medium was required to be able to supply the developing nursery and market garden trade. And during the 1930s, Bill Lawrence and John Newell at the John Innes Institute, which at that time was based in Kent, began to develop what later became to be known as the John Innes range of composts. The full range consists of a seed sowing compost, John Innes number 1, John Innes number 2, and John Innes number 3. There are also ericaceous variations. It was felt that seedlings on plants at different stages of growth require different strength composts. So the principle was that you would sow the seed into the seed compost, and when the seedling had developed sufficiently, it was ready to be transferred into the next stage. It would be moved into John Innes number 1, which had just enough fertilizer to push the seedling along to get it to a reasonable size, ready for planting out. If the plants required further growing, then they will be moved into pots or trays filled with John Innes number 2. John Innes number 1 is mainly used in the production of bedding and young vegetable transplants. John Innes number 2 was made to the same formula as John Innes number 1, except that it has twice the quantity of fertilizer in it, which means it was able to produce and sustain larger growing plants. When plants that have been grown in John Innes number 1 require potting on to the next stage, they are then moved into John Innes number 2, and this usually will be their final potting, although they may need some supplementary feeding towards the end of the summer. John Innes number 2 is an excellent choice for pots, containers and hanging baskets because of the extra weight. It gives them stability, especially with hanging baskets that may swing around in high winds. It also has the ability to hold on to moisture and nutrients for over a longer period, and this helps to reduce the stress to plants on hot or windy days. The big beast in the family is John Innes number 3, and this almost compares with garden soil. It's the strongest of the John Innes mixtures and is used for growing plants in pots and containers on a permanent basis. John Innes number 3 contains 3 times as much fertilizer as John Innes number 1, and the other characteristic that it has is that you can see that the soil lumps are much larger than any other composts. This helps to improve the compost drainage and to maintain its structure over a long period. And this is what makes it highly suitable for growing ornamental trees and shrubs, and also fruit trees and softfruit bushes. So to sum up, you have John Innes number 3 that was developed to grow larger, woodier plants over a longer period of time, almost permanently in pots or containers. And then you have number 2 that was developed really for the growth of larger display plants over a summer season. And then we come to John Innes number 1, which was developed for the growth really of annual plants, such as here you can see what you're most likely to be confronted with these days. You have the soilless based compost with the seed sowing, and then you have the general purpose compost, which really was designed to replace the John Innes number 1, John Innes number 2, which are all soil based composts. What generally happens these days is that they tend to mix the general purpose potting compost with John Innes number 2 or John Innes number 3, whatever it suits the subject that's to be grown in it. It's worth mentioning as well that in the John Innes range there is an ericaceous compost that is suitable for growing heathers, rhododendrons, and of course these days blueberries that are highly popular. And the same thing goes with the soilless composts. Although they contain peat and other similar products, they're not entirely acid. There is a little bit of lime in them. So it's always worth looking around before you buy these plants to check and get a suitable compost. And finally, we're looking at a cuttings compost, which really is the seed compost with some extra grit added to it to improve the drainage and to encourage the root development. And when you finally prepare the compost, just sprinkle a 3mm in 1/8 of a range of grit across the surface. And finally, you look at some of the things you can add to the compost. You have controlled fertilizer granules, which respond to the heat and to the wet. So if it isn't required, they don't release their fertilizers. Something else that is very popular are food tablets, which really are the granules in a little cluster about the size of a tip of your thumb, and you push several of these into hanging baskets containers to help through. And once again, you can get 3, 6, 9, 12-month release periods with them. This is water retentive gel. Now you have to be careful with this because lots of composts today have wetting agents in them, and it's not always advisable to add water gel to it, so check, because what can happen in severe drought conditions, the gel will actually take water out of the compost itself. And here we have sort of, I suppose, the ultimate in luxury gardening is a combination of them both, which is the nutrients and the gel all in one pack. These things you would normally add to hanging baskets or containers for the summer period. But be careful once again, if you're using a designated basket container type compost. And finally, my favorite of all, which I always go back to, is seaweed. I just water the plants with it, spray the plants with it, and it seems to sort of help their general health and condition. Diolch, and thank you for watching. Goodbye for now, but if you would like to see any more, please hit the subscribe and like buttons.